Welcome to another episode of What's at Stake, a Penta podcast. I'm your host, Bryan DeAngelis, a partner here at Penta. And today I'm recording live from our London offices for a special episode of the show. I'm here in London this week, meeting with some of our international clients and meeting with a lot of our team here on the ground in London, both on the strategy side of our business and the intelligence side. And I have two colleagues that I'm working very closely with joining us for today's episode. David Cook is the partner leading Penta Strategies European division of our international financial services practice. And Victoria Walsh is the partner leading the financial services and professional services sector for our intelligence division, both here in London. David, Victoria, thanks for joining us on the show this week.
Very happy to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for inviting us.
Thanks for having me in your lovely city. David, let's start with you. So it's been a few months now since Hume Brophy joined Penta, but I also want to back up a little bit and talk a bit about your career before Hume Brophy and before Penta, and then I'd love to do the same with Victoria. But why don't you start? Tell me a little bit about your background and what brought you originally to this firm.
Yeah, happy to. So I started my career in the UK civil service as a policymaker at the Treasury, looking at a whole range of issues from international debt to social policy, childcare, a lot of the issues still around today. I worked in our international development department. And then actually what was a key part of my career was I joined the then FSA in September 2008. And actually my first day at the regulator was the day that Lehman's failed. Wow. So I never actually did the job that I'd been recruited for. I was straight into the crisis team. We were tasked by the government to do something called the Turner Review, which was look at the causes of the crisis and look at the changes in the regulatory structure that should follow. And then we set up a financial stability department. So really that sort of changed the direction of my career, got me really interested in financial regulation. And then after a while, I had the opportunity to move to Brussels with the UK's Foreign Office. And we were in what was then called UKREP, which is the UK's representation to the EU. And I headed up the team there that was responsible for negotiating the changes in financial service regulation that were coming out of the financial crisis. So one way of seeing that is I was sort of lucky enough to be there at ground zero, work out what had happened and sort of come up with some principles about how the regulatory structure should change. And then was part of the process of actually implementing that new regulation, which covered the UK and the EU at the time. We didn't always get our own way, but, the UK was really important in shaping that.
Big player, yes.
Yeah. And then after spending some time there, I decided I wanted to get some private sector experience. And I was offered a job at a company called Market, which was a very successful, global business, but a UK firm looking at, data and fintech, particularly following regulation and providing solutions for the market to meet the regulatory requirements, coming out of the financial crisis that were being implemented at the time, very, very costly. And that gave me a really good insight into how the regulation hits the industry, unintended consequences, how the industry shapes itself around regulatory requirements, and also, the whole new world of data and benchmarks. And, that was really coming into its own at the time. And then, having done that for 6 years, I really wanted to get back to a very wide sort of portfolio where I could follow a lot of issues and fix them up, to certain clients, and what was happening, what was interesting, and who it affected in a much broader way, and that's why I joined Hume Brophy.
That's great. And tell us a little bit about your role here at Penta, formerly Hume Brophy, which joined Penta back in January. What's the work you're leading on for us here over in Europe and Asia?
So yeah, I head up, before we joined Penta, I headed up Hume Brophy's financial services work, led the practice in both Europe and Asia. What we're trying to do is build a practice that offers a truly kind of integrated campaigning service for our clients, so that if you think about it, when I was client side and I used to use consultancies, it was very frustrating that you would have to, I want to talk about what's happening in the EU. I'll talk to the team in Brussels, and it's a completely separate team to talk about the UK.
Right.
Similarly, out in Asia, it didn't seem to be suited to what the client really wanted. And in Hume Brophy, we were trying, what attracted me to Hume Brophy is they're trying to meet that, trying to come say, right, the issues are the same. In many ways, in many cases, the client's the same. Why don't we just have a joined up approach? And my experience working particularly across the UK and Brussels was really important for that. And then we also are trying to offer a campaigning service, which is, sometimes you see communications can be different to public affairs, but ultimately there is an objective and there are levers and tools to get to those objectives, and they should be working together. And then finally, I was attracted to Hume Brophy because it was an Irish company that had a significant presence in London, a significant presence in Brussels, some other presence around Europe and some offices in Asia. And that, if you were thinking about a post-Brexit service, a lot of the English-speaking world were moving their operations from London to, or at least duplicating their operations in Dublin for regulatory reasons. So they were still subject to EU regulation, still subject to UK regulation, with an Irish element. And, Asia is clearly, the sort of fastest growing part of the economy.
Certainly.
And actually waking up to its own ability to influence the sort of regulatory agenda as well.
Yeah. I want to come back to the different cities in a minute, because I think that's a big part of it. But you mentioned a frustration a minute ago, and I think that's a good theme. In my career, I've seen similar frustrations where we're servicing financial services clients out of DC or New York, and we have to go help them find another firm in Brussels to service that, or London to service the UK. The same thing also happened where I often found my clients swimming in data and working with 4 or 5 different data firms, and we were either getting it secondhand as the strategy advisor, or we would find and try to help our clients sort of navigate all these different inputs they're getting. That obviously is, as some of the listeners have heard, is one of the big reasons we teamed up almost a year and a half ago, I guess now, Victoria, with what was then Alva and Flag Media Analytics and Ballast Research and others. And it's to bring that intelligence, that research and data to the kind of strategy teams to work hand in hand to really advise our clients. So that's a long wind up, but Victoria, let me bring you in here to talk a little bit about sort of your path to Alva, but also I'd love to hear, how you guys do some of that work, bringing that intelligence to clients and how we sort of team up together to service them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Brian. So if I just start off a bit about my career background. So like many of us here at Penta, I actually started out in the government and political world. So after sort of graduating from university, I spent a number of years as a civil servant leading Whitehall government communication campaigns. During that time, I spent some time actually at 10 Downing Street in the Prime Minister's office, working across strategic communications. And one of the sort of the main goals of that was to ensure that the Prime Minister's communications and announcements were coordinated across all sort of Whitehall departments, so that we had a real kind of seamless communications across government as a whole. And it was during that time that I kind of developed a real keen interest on the sort of the more political side of things. And as you know, kind of as a civil servant, you have to be very non-political. And it was during that time that I was actually approached to be the spokesperson on the 2008 Mayor of London campaign. And I thought, fantastic opportunity to get, sort of into the heart of politics. It was actually the first election campaign that Boris Johnson was running in. So I knew it was going to be, very high profile and extremely interesting and very busy. And it certainly was. I think probably during those 6 months of that election campaign, I think I probably gained about 6 years worth of experience. But yeah, got to work with some incredible politicians and some great people at the UK Labour Party. And at the end of the election, I was approached to take on a role as a senior media advisor in the Labour Party HQ. And at this time, it was sort of 2 years out of the 2010 general election. So again, I thought, great time to be in politics. Ended up spending about 3 to 4 years working at the Labour Party, working on the general election and European elections and local elections. Really got to sort of work with, Prime Minister Gordon Brown at the time, advising him ahead of doing key media pieces and key media interviews, but also other cabinet ministers ahead of their sort of, media appearances as well. And it was during that time that obviously, we had the sort of the financial crash, and obviously a lot of the news agenda was focused around that, and I developed a real interest in the sort of financial side of things. And in 2011, I sort of thought about, kind of what was going to be next in my career. And I saw a role advertised at what was called Royal Bank of Scotland, RBS, obviously now known as NatWest. And I thought to myself, what a great organisation to go and work for, because this was, beginning of 2011. Their reputation was absolutely rock bottom. I knew they were going to be going through sort of major turnaround, both internally and externally. And I thought to myself, great business to go and be part of that turnaround. And a turnaround indeed it was. When I started working there were, I think, 150,000 plus employees, working globally, massive kind of global bank. And when I left in 2018, there was 80,000 employees, and very much a kind of, UK focused, UK centric bank that had gone through kind of massive, huge turnaround. So sort of during that sort of 7-8 years that I worked at RBS, I worked across a number of different parts of the bank. So I started off actually working in the investment banking arm, and then moved across to the corporate and commercial, and spent quite a lot of time in there working with senior leaders on their strategic communications and leading both external and internal communications. And then my final role was as head of CEO and chairman communications. So I led a team, and we looked after both internal and external comms for the CEO and chairman. And I think that's really interesting, their approach, in that they really understood, that internal communications had to be 100% aligned with kind of the external side of what we were saying as well. And it was really important that, employees were hearing about things, changes, because there were massive changes going on, that they were hearing about those things, at the same time, if not before, kind of, the press and the media were hearing about them. And I was very lucky. I got to work with a great leader, Ross McEwen, who was CEO of RBS. Sure. And, I think we talk a lot in communications about the importance of, having really transparent and visible leaders, and how important it is that, they They really understand kind of, sort of reputation. They understand stakeholders. They understand kind of, sort of what's happening internally as well as externally. And he really, really understood that, had a huge amount of time for communications. He really understood, in terms of the change that they were going through as a bank, how important, kind of strategic communications was for that. But I think the most important part was that he really understood how important it was to create that culture of doing the right thing. And I think, everything that's been going on, across the world at the moment in terms of what's going on financially, when we look at things like Credit Suisse and Silicon Valley Bank, I think that the importance of having that leadership and that, that I guess that kind of that governance and that framework, and really honing in on that message of kind of creating that right culture internally, and kind of, doing the right thing, and for people to be able to sort of bring their whole and true selves to work. And I think that's really important. So my point to all of that was, it was a really interesting time working there. And once I left there, I then moved across to Royal Bank of Canada, RBC, and spent some time working there for their Investor and Treasury Services division. They actually had a fairly new CEO. So again, I spent some time working on both internal and external communication plans for the CEO. And they were going through some major kind of structural changes internally as well. And at that point, 2022, I then joined what was Alva. Obviously, we're now part of the Penta Group, as managing director of the financial services and professional services sector team, and I'm now partner on the intelligence side. So in terms of how sort of, we, like you said, Bryan, how we work with clients and how we work across the group. So I think, I think the sort of easiest way to explain it is it's about having that really accurate picture in terms of the data and what is actually out there. So, what are stakeholders saying about a company? What is their perception of that company? What are the kind of the big risk factors out there for companies? And what are also the opportunities out there? So in terms of, what are some companies talking about that actually other companies really aren't very visible on? So what we do is we ingest over 25 million pieces of content every single day. So that is all publicly available information. And that is across all different forms. So we're not just looking at media, we're also looking at things like, Hansard reports, NGO papers, white papers, parliamentary records, anything that is, publicly available and that has an open API, we are monitoring, and we then digest that information. And we have analysts and consultants who are experts in the financial services and professional services sector, and they kind of verify all of that data and create kind of meaningful, intelligent reports and for our clients. So, for example, we can look at sort of the media intelligence side of things, and look and sort of advise clients on what's the impact of their communications. We can look at the reputation intelligence, so looking at where they stand, what is their reputation amongst whether that's regulators or consumers or employees. And obviously this then helps that strategy intelligence, and that's how we work with our strategy partners, because it really, it drives that strategy. So you're not just, you're not just using your best guesses. It's actually based on data and real insight. And just providing that extra layer of intelligence to our strategy.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point here. We just heard your very impressive background. Again, not trying to sell too hard on our own podcast, but there's a lot of firms out there that produce data that can provide qualitative, quantitative reports for clients, that can send it to firms like former HBS and others who can dig into that data. But what's really unique about what you all are doing, and I think what the three of us and our teams are doing together, is you have experience being in that seat that some of our clients now find themselves in. David and I have been in different positions of government as well as have you. We understand these issues, so can look at that data and really pull out the insights we know our clients are going to care about, or that they should be caring about and they should be paying attention to. And I think that is truly unique in the market. I assume you both agree.
So I would say that I would agree. And I'd say, think about my own experience. I mean, we have used monitoring services both in government and in business, or I've used monitoring services. And actually what you get, it's not unhelpful, but it doesn't really, you just end up with more stuff to read.
Right.
And you end up with no analysis. It just doesn't tell you anything other than
at best it's confirmation.
You've got 25 billion pieces of information to read every day.
Yeah.
I mean, since joining Penta, and I do think it's truly unique, but in some ways, the information coming from our intelligence side, it sort of confirms what has often been seen as sort of gut feeling.
Yes. Yeah.
And actually, that's quite good. And I'd be shocked if it didn't. But there are things, the relative importance of things is like, that's interesting. And other stuff that maybe you haven't thought about because it's coming down the track and it's not surfaced with us yet. And the other thing that is absolutely critical, I think, is you can see the change. So when you would go and report our sort of successes and what we were doing to CEO or the board, you didn't really have any data to say. I mean, there are data like, we've had this number of meetings,
right?
Or, this piece of legislation has ended up in a different place. But, your causality of that is very complicated to explain. But when you can see that sentiment among policymakers on an issue or on a firm is changing, that's really powerful. And in my view, something quite unique.
Yeah. And then when you can take that, as Victoria and her team do, and feel free to jump in, Victoria, to all of your stakeholders, right? So showing your CEO where we're making the impact with policymakers, where that's also playing out with employees or customers or investors or whatever the key audience may be, and how that one issue is impacting all of them, maybe a little bit differently, maybe a little bit more severe in different places, is where we can really start to unlock some strategic answers for that C-suite.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like you said, Bryan, for so many people, and I've been in that position, in sort of my kind of 20-year history in comms, like where, you do often have to kind of create strategy and make really important decisions about, kind of communication issues and challenges based on that gut instinct. And actually having the data to drive those decisions is so powerful. And I think, that's why sort of when they were kind of recruiting for this role, they were really keen that sort of bringing somebody in who's almost been on the client side, so that, as you say, I sort of have that understanding of, being able to go to the C-suite and kind of having to advise them on what they should be doing reputationally, what they should be doing comms-wise. And I think just having that experience of knowing the challenges of kind of corporate communications and corporate affairs professionals is really key. And I think also another, kind of key point is that, as I mentioned, our sort of analysts and consultants, they are sort of, sector experts, and they do spend, kind of hours and hours of time going through the data, but not just going through the data, but they know the issues in the sector. They know the issues for the client. They know the client's kind of, key deliverables and priority themes. And they're really ensuring that they're kind of drawing out the right insights for the client so that they can actually make strategic decisions, based on those insights.
And,
Right.
and another interesting point I think it's worth spelling out here is the way that we're able to look at different groups of stakeholders in almost the same way, because historically people are like, well, policymakers are not the same as employees, are not the same as investors.
That's a good point.
And actually, if you look at something like ESG, it matters for everybody in different ways.
In much different ways, right?
Yeah, but if you're like running your ESG communications program, it matters to your employees or prospective employees, because they want to know what their employer is doing in this area. It matters to your investors, who may have a mandate to only invest in certain kinds of areas. It matters to policymakers, because they're not going to listen to you if you don't have the credibility. And therefore, you might find that things really affect the way that you fund yourself or the products you can issue. And thinking about these things together is really important.
Agree.
Absolutely. And I think also, we've seen, obviously, like if we look at what happened with Silicon Valley Bank, data and social media is moving so fast now. I mean, if you look, in 2008, the largest bank collapse in the US, Washington Mutual, that played out over 8 months. SVB took 2 days. And then that is the type of speed that things are traveling with. And, I think being able to provide clients with that data and intelligence as they need it and how they need it is so important.
So let's shift gears a little bit on that point. And I also want to get a few minutes of both of your time and pick your expert brains. So we are recording this in early April, and over the past few weeks, we've probably all three of us have had a little bit of flashbacks to 2008, as Victoria just mentioned. But we are in some pretty difficult times for both the global economy and I would say the financial services sector in particular, both coming out of the pandemic. We have central banks trying their hardest to fight off inflation and the challenges that come with that. And, depending on how you look at some things, that certainly was a major factor in the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. There were a whole lot of other issues as well, which we've talked about on previous podcasts. Credit Suisse. I mean, we're starting to see some real strains on the global financial system. Where do you all see us going kind of over the next few months? What do you think will be some of the major issues that both our clients and I would say policymakers and regulators need to be looking at?
Well, I think, to just think about Silicon Valley Bank, it's a great example of you need to get your comms right, because things, as Victoria's saying, things move so quickly now. I mean, I remember during, the Northern Rock banking crisis, and there were teams of cameras following around Northern Rock branches looking for cues so they could show them. I mean, now this stuff is just being fired out all over social media. And, it's an amplifier. If you get your message wrong, it's amplified as a big problem.
Right.
If you get your message right, it can do the same. It can help you. And you also need to be ready for a crisis when it hits. It's no point thinking about it. After it happens, you need to be ready, because confidence is so important in financial institutions. I mean, on a more of a kind of forward-looking basis, it's been really interesting in the UK and in the EU as well, that over the last few years, for various reasons, anemic growth, Brexit, and so on, there's competitiveness has sort of re-entered the language of regulators. Not always willing, it seems to me, right. but it's there. And then we've got elections coming up in both Europe and in the UK next year. How things have gone over has Brexit been a success, for example? Regulatory freedoms are a big part of that. So you've got a sort of direction of, right, we need to do something with regulation, then bang, this comes along. And it's making people think differently. There isn't, you can't just say, oh, well, regulators are holding us back anymore. And that's going to be really interesting for the next year, because, how do you keep, how do you move towards more proportionate, efficient, effective regulation without just sounding like you're asking for deregulation, which sort of has become it's a far more important message for the next 12 months, in my view.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another thing that it raises that we think that's happened is sort of the importance of the as I mentioned previously, the sort of, the G in ESG, so that governance part of things. I mean, if we look at Silicon Valley Bank, they had no CRO for 8 months of 2022. And, I think that suggests a sort of, their kind of their attitude to sort of risk taking, and that, appointing a new CRO wasn't perhaps a priority for them at the time. And I think, there's for a long time, there's been this sort of, this growing trend of, looking at the importance of ESG. But I think, particularly on the governance side, and particularly on the kind of the leadership of these financial institutions, I think that's going to, we're going to see growing sort of more and more importance in that area.
We are seeing a very sort of populist backlash in the US around the bailout, if you will, or at least the response to SVB in the United States. You've got both what we would consider the far right of the Republican Party and the far left of the Democratic Party calling for, CEO pay clawbacks, calling for more oversight over the Federal Reserve, making accusations again of it being a taxpayer-led bailout. It's an interesting time, as the Fed just 2 months ago in the US, we felt there was strong consensus that they were doing a pretty good job and going to, quote unquote, land the plane for this soft landing we were looking for. Now we're seeing scrutiny around Fed Chairman Powell and others that maybe we're doing a bit more of a crash landing. Maybe we've mishandled some of this on the Federal Reserve side. All of this is leading up to, we're about a year and a half away from an election, and we're seeing a lot of candidates who will likely oppose current President Biden, really grab onto this issue around what do taxpayers want, what do the American people want around this front, and are regulators going too far? I'm curious if you're seeing the same thing in Europe and Asia, because we're set to tackle some big issues in the US around Basel III, around cryptocurrency legislation, around other issues, all of which now feels like has a different lens on it as the politics get really hyped up stateside.
So I think, there are some very good points there. And, I have some sympathy for policymakers and regulators on the grounds that you almost always get it wrong, and it's almost always your fault for getting it wrong. And whether that is that you've been the one who has, sort of slowed the economy down, or you've been the one that sped it up. For me, from my experience of sort of 2008 to 2010, it shows that there are still problems in the regulatory structure. If I had the answer, I would have said it at the time, but, implicitly the taxpayer is still around the banking system. Do you let people lose their deposits,
right? Or
do you let the bank go? I mean, and ultimately, we haven't quite, or the regulatory community hasn't quite got it right yet. And I think that's what this sort of recent episode has shown.
I think that's right. Yeah. Any final thoughts on that point before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think, in the UK, as David said, it's really interesting what's happening. I mean, I think we've seen, that, Basel III has hit sort of SME lending and economic growth sort of in the kind of early sort of 2010s to now, and something that hasn't happened in the US. We've sort of seen it booming there. And I think, a lot of people are questioning whether the UK should continue to push through with plans to sort of create a lighter regulatory framework for smaller banks, especially after what we've seen with, Silicon Valley Bank. But I think ultimately what it comes down to is that, would that create less stability? I think the rescue of Credit Suisse by UBS shows that even banks, subject to really stringent forms of regulation, are not immune from that failure. And that comes back to the whole point around, sort of that governance framework. And I think, how this plays out over the next kind of 6 to 12 months is going to be really interesting from, whether that's from a kind of UK or US perspective or globally.
Yeah, how do we maintain confidence in the system?
Right.
So when one part of the system goes wrong, and as I said, you couldn't get more different than Credit Suisse and Silicon Valley. But, there's still this feeling that there's a problem in one part of the forest, the whole forest's going to burn down. It's still there. And again, it comes back to confidence and, communications and knowing what you're going to do in different scenarios is really important.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And I think we'll leave it there, but I want to thank both of you for a successful first international podcast for Penta. And certainly I hope not your last guest appearances. You all have been great, and I hope we can get you back on maybe on some happier topics around the financial industry, but certainly want to use your expertise again sometime soon.
Thanks very much, Brian.
Great.
Always happy to talk policy.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us, Brian.
And for our audience, thanks for tuning into another episode of What's at Stake. You can subscribe to the Penta podcast channel wherever you get your podcasts. Please do like and leave us a review. And you can also find us on Twitter @PentaGRP or on our website, pentagroup.co. I'm Bryan DeAngelis. Thanks again for listening to What's at Stake.